certainly the size of the crowd which attends this event each year reflects not only the affection with which Baltimoreans regard their own most prominent daily newspaper, but also, I think, their interest in meeting face-to-face some of the journalists whose bylines they've gotten to know over the years. The panel's intention this evening is to examine the possibilities for President Reagan's last year in office. Will it be the year of the lame duck, or a year of achievement in arms control in Central America, in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere? Mr. Stern, who will chair the panel, has been with the Sun since 1953. He has served as chief of the Sun's London Bureau and Bonn Bureau, assistant chief of the Washington Bureau, and since 1972 as editor of the editorial page. Mr. Stern has also traveled extensively throughout Western and Eastern Europe, Africa, the Middle East, and the Soviet Union. Mr. Broning is the diplomatic correspondent for the Baltimore Sun. Previously, he served for 8 years as editor of the Sun's opinion commentary page, and earlier as a foreign correspondent for 11 years with the Associated Press, serving in Paris, Moscow, and Lisbon. Mr. Cordray was the Pentagon correspondent of the United Press International before joining the Sun's Washington Bureau in 1967. He is the Baltimore Sun defense correspondent and is also a regular panelist on Public Broadcasting's award-winning program, Washington Week in Review. Each year, it's wonderful to hear what these three gentlemen have to say, and we are looking forward just as much tonight to hearing all of you as we have in the past, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you back once again. Mr. Stern.
Right. Thank you, Mrs. Reese. Thank you, Mr. Jackson. And thank you all for coming out on a very cold night into a very hot room. This is our 8th annual meeting of the Baltimore Sun panel on foreign affairs, so I think we are reaching the stage of calling it a tradition. When we first met, we were in the closing, waning days of the Carter administration, wondering what was going to befall the world and this country under the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Now, as we meet for our 8th time, we are entering the last year of the Reagan administration, and I think next year, God willing that we meet, most of our attention will be on the future foreign policy of the president-elect, whoever he might be. So I thought it would be an excellent opportunity this year to ask my colleagues, Mr. Broning and Mr. Cordray, to give us a bit of a summing up of the whole Reagan era, a bit of a look at the diplomatic and security issues that they expect to come up during the coming year. And then after they're finished, I might have a couple comments on the political outlook. So let's start with my friend Charles Cordray, who is going to discuss particularly arms control agreements, the situation in NATO, and the Soviet-American relationship. Charles?
Thanks, Joe. And in 7 minutes or 3, or as the case may be, ladies and gentlemen, my wife has promised not to ask questions later, but she did ask one when we first got here, and that is, does the council always consult the Farmer's Almanac to find the coldest night in the year for this occasion? And in any case, we are certainly overwhelmed by this massive attendance on such a night, and thank you so much. The Reagan years in arms control, it's easy for me to summarize because it all happened in December. Previous to that, the president was building up a military force that he thought would put him into position for negotiating arms control. That's one way of putting it. And so we got the agreement on intermediate range nuclear forces, the elimination of missiles in Europe, signed at the summit. I think some of the euphoria has dissipated since that time as we get back to realities and realize that interests are what are determining what the two countries do. But I do feel, and would like to say a few words about it tonight, that 1988 is going to be an arms control year. Mr. Reagan would want a big agreement reducing the intercontinental forces, which are the ones that are important, to cap his administration. And Mr. Gorbachev certainly would want such an agreement and has been quite straightforward about it, to improve his own domestic situation, to make the external situation more favorable to restructuring within the Soviet Union. But I think we ought to put arms control in some perspective just in case we don't get the agreement in time for the summit. The people at Harvard have done a big study on the results of arms control over the past 25 years, and it's worthwhile to remember that they have been exceedingly modest, that they are not just a thing unto themselves, but should be. Arms control should be a part of a nation's security policy in general. Arms control up to now has never brought about any reductions in military forces. I'm speaking in the post-war era, the last 25 years, has not caused any reduction of military forces, has not caused any country not to build something that it wanted to, has allowed buildups, in fact, has not stopped qualitative improvements in arms, and has not caused any restructuring of nations' military forces. So keep that in mind. If we don't get the agreement that Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev so urgently want, the world will not come to an end. Nuclear war will not break out. The aim of arms control negotiations between the United States and the Soviet Union has got to be not reduction of nuclear weapons for its own sake, but something that is a nice mouth-filling phrase, strategic stability. People love to roll that one around. What it means is that the situation would be so balanced that neither country would dare to attack the other because it would know that it would mean its own suicide. And that would be strategic stability. You do not necessarily achieve it at a lower level of nuclear weapons. And I think one of the biggest issues in 1988 as arms control negotiations proceed is going to be, are we reducing nuclear weapons too much, too fast? I know that that issue hasn't sprung to the forefront yet, but I'm quite confident that it will. Now, the agreement that was signed having to do with missiles in Europe was a sideshow compared with the one that is to be negotiated in 1988, or that we assume is to be negotiated in 1988. It is being opposed, of course, by many people, and strangely enough, from right to left or left to right, but the reasons for opposing this agreement seem to me to have very little to do with the agreement itself. Many people oppose the agreement eliminating nuclear missiles in Europe on the grounds that our conventional forces aren't adequate to handle the war that will come after the nukes are gone. This is slightly ridiculous, I think, when you consider that perhaps 13,000 to 15,000 nuclear weapons will remain on the two sides in Europe after these missiles are destroyed. I don't think for one moment that our defense and Europe's are going to become decoupled as a result of this agreement, but that's another challenge it faces. And also, it's opposed because the Russians are still fighting in Afghanistan. I mean, this is, people might want to put a reservation on the agreement, on the treaty in the Senate saying, as long as they're fighting in Afghanistan, we're not going to eliminate missiles in Europe. So the opposition to the agreement, as I say, seems to be mainly for reasons having little to do with the agreement itself. Just one word or two on defense in general in 1988. I think that there was symbolism in the departure of Caspar Weinberger as Secretary of Defense. I don't know that it was the reason for his departure, but I think the great symbolism of it was that the Reagan administration had come to a change, that arms control was in, defense build-up, for many reasons that we can get onto if you want to later, was out, and that now was the time to go. I think that we're going to see our defense program recast. I think I've predicted this here before, and that what you're going to see now and the remainder of this decade is going to be an effort to decide whether we must cut our nuclear weapons, regardless of what the Soviet Union does because of a budget squeeze, or, on the other hand, are we going to cut our conventional forces, cut men, cut operational readiness, cut formations, air wings, fleets and things of this sort. It seems to me to be perfectly inevitable. Finally, while some of this may be unilateral, I think the favorable point to mention is that the Soviet Union wants to do the same thing and has been quite explicit about it, that they do indeed want to cut their own investment in defense, and so somehow we have to hope we'll work our way through this as the year goes on. Thank you.
To illustrate some of the difficulty that we as journalists face in trying to sum up the Reagan years, I'll go back to a man who was one of the most perceptive and intelligent of the Secretaries of State, and that was Dean Acheson, who, in his memoir of his time in government, had this to say as an introduction: "The period covered by this book was of great obscurity to those who lived through it." So you'll forgive us if we're not able to forecast accurately what's to come, or if we haven't forecasted in the past. I think one way of looking at the Reagan administration's foreign policy and trying to judge it is what it set out to do when it came to office. And that was, first of all, to resume, to reassert, to restore to the central place of American foreign policy the U.S.-Soviet relationship, which his predecessor, Jimmy Carter, had tried to shun aside for other considerations. He brought to this task a deep animus and a deep suspicion of the Soviet Union. If you'll remember, he described it as the evil empire. He described it as a place whose leaders would lie and cheat and steal to do almost any evil deed to advance their ends. And now, as we enter the last year of the Reagan administration, we find that he himself has been the host to the evil emperor himself. So what we've had, I guess, is a sort of the strong gravitational pull of reality, which has tended to modify and temper to some extent, but not entirely, some of the ideological drive that propelled the Reagan administration foreign policy. What we've come to, as we probably will come to unless we want to go to war, is an acceptance that we must have a long-term competition with the Soviet Union, but it must be a regulated competition. A symbol of this is, I suppose, the arms control agreement that was just signed, as Charlie mentioned, in December. Another side of the Reagan administration is attending to the ideological bent, was brought to fore in a very dramatic and interesting manner during the hearings over the past summer having to do with the Iran-Contra affair. Oliver North thought it was a neat idea to sell arms to the Iranians in a tacit exchange for hostages, and to use some of the proceeds of this to finance a war in Nicaragua by opponents of the Sandinista regime, which the Reagan administration would like to see out of office. One of the things that became clear during these hearings and the repeated disclosures of senior State Department officials and others telling less than the entire truth to Congress when questioned about whether or not they were clandestine programs to help the Contras out against, in the face of a congressional ban on this. One is reminded that of Lord Wootton's saying in the 17th century of his definition of a diplomat. A diplomat, he said, is an honest man sent abroad to lie for his country. The Iran-Contra hearings showed that you don't have to leave town. Just to conclude, without judging entirely some of the successes and failures of the administration, was another aspect of this restoring Soviet-American relations to the center of foreign policy concerns, and that is what is known as the Reagan Doctrine. The Reagan Doctrine is a negation of what was known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, that what the Soviets and their allies have acquired through one means or another is not to be given up. Well, President Reagan and his associates came to power with a belief that these things could be undone, that the gains were reversible. With this, we have legal, clandestine American aid to, for example, the UNITA rebels or insurgency in Angola, in an attempt to overthrow a pro-Marxist or pro-Soviet Marxist regime there. The aid to the Contras in an attempt to destabilize, if not overthrow, the Sandinista regime in Nicaragua. And probably most importantly and most successful is the clandestine program to aid the Afghan rebels in Afghanistan, who will, through American aid, have been able to change the terms of the war. And if the signals that we read are correct, the Soviets are on the verge of finally making a decision to pull out, and some Americans are wondering if there will be a replay of the American departure from Vietnam, of Soviet helicopters taking American diplomats from the Soviet embassy in Kabul. This is something the Soviets are trying to avoid, but to the extent that it's even being considered, indicates to some extent a success of this part of Reagan policy.
1 month and 2 nights from tonight, we'll all be gathered around our friendly television sets listening to the returns from Iowa. 2 months and 2 nights from tonight, we'll all be gathered in the same spot to hear the results of Super Tuesday, in which all of you will have an opportunity to vote your choice for the man who will supposedly be in charge of foreign policy for the next 4 years. So we really don't have very much time left so far as the citizens' input into direction of foreign policy. Now, maybe the Democrats will finally postpone their decision until the convention. It's probably a pretty good guess that the Republicans will not. But I think we ought to start concentrating a little bit on what the foreign policy issues will be in the election this year, how the candidates who have come forward have come down on various questions. I'd like to start by reading from the Gospel according to Walter Mondale. This is what Walter Mondale has to say, and I find it one of the most interesting political statements I've read in a long time. Democrats are in a real box. Reagan has practiced the politics of subtraction. He knows the public wants to spend money on the old folks, protecting the environment, and aiding education. And he's figured out the only way to stop it is to deny the revenues. No matter how powerful the arguments the Democrats make for the use of government to serve some purpose, the answer must be no. What we're dealing with are economic constraints on policy as a result of Reagan policy that inevitably will affect the campaign. I would also like to quote some more gospel, Democratic gospel. This is from the 1984 convention platform of the Democratic Party, where they described Ronald Reagan as the president who opposed every nuclear arms control agreement since the bomb went off. They also said the Reagan administration points to Soviet repression, but it has no answer other than to escalate the arms race. We now have reached the ironic political situation where every one of the 7 Democratic candidates for president has warmly endorsed the INF treaty negotiated by this man who had opposed every arms agreement since the bomb went off. We also are in the ironic situation where only 2 of the 6 announced Republican candidates have accepted the same treaty. So you have a situation where arms control is no longer an issue, at least at this moment, on the table between the parties. It's only an issue within the Republican Party. I think this has to affect the entire nature of the campaign. If you listen to the Democratic candidates, the main criticism they raise against the Reagan administration has to do with aid to the Contras. This has become almost a litmus test for running for the presidential nomination on the Democratic Party. How this will shape out during the year ahead is very, very problematical. The Democrats have tried but have failed to handle the Contra issue repeatedly. I think in the year of 1986 there were something like 20 roll calls on the issue in the House, and there's been a flipping and a flopping all through. We are scheduled anyway to have another vote on Contra aid in February, but this will depend a great deal on what happens when the Central American presidents meet on the 15th of January, and also on what the response of the Nicaraguan government is to this. So even on what seems to be a litmus test for the Democrats in foreign policy, the issue is very murky. It could be that if Ortega cooperates with Reagan, as he seems to do on almost every crisis occasion, he will undercut the Democratic position, and if that is the case, you could have even this issue somewhat removed from the campaign. In my opinion, the major enduring foreign policy issue that we might be addressing during the coming year is the economic issue, the impact of the Reagan deficits, trade deficits, and government deficits on the world situation, and that, of course, affecting our economy as it affects the others. On this issue, I don't find all that much to differentiate any of the candidates in either party at this stage. Everybody is for American competitiveness. Everybody is for increasing our exports and improving the education of American children and sharpening up our technology and so forth. But so far as a well-defined political issue, it has really not emerged as yet. So with these introductory comments, I would like to do what we have been doing for 8 years now, which is to throw the session into question and answer, and we'll try to see how things go from there. Thank you. If anybody who wishes to pose a question, if you just say to whom you want this question addressed. And also, Mrs. Rigg, are we supposed to repeat the question, or is that not necessary?
I think it would help if you repeated the question.
All right. Yes.
Could, to anyone, could you estimate the prospects for the future of El Salvador?
The question is, and this is to any of us, could we estimate the prospects for the future in El Salvador? Steve, do you want to say a couple words on this?
Tenuous. The government and its military forces have been holding their own, if not making progress against the insurrection. The problem, and then the rebels themselves, dependent as they are on Cuba and on Nicaragua, must be looking with some trepidation to the prospect, however slender it might be, of some sort of overall political settlement in Central America. On the government side, There are internal problems regarding the stability of the government. The question has never been settled really definitively about whether or not there's going to be a democratic regime that's going to last in El Salvador. Duarte is becoming under more and more pressure and more criticism from the right. There's more disillusionment on the non-communist left, and the insurgency hasn't gone away. A lot will depend, I suppose, on the outcome of the whole region, whether or not the Sandinistas can sustain themselves, whether or not they will agree to something that we can agree to. But as it stands now, they're holding their own. As far as the rebels are concerned, the fact that they still exist is something of a victory for them, as it is with any insurgents.
I'd like to add just one other thing, that the most immediate problem for the Duarte government at this point seems to be from the right rather than the left. Catholic church officials in El Salvador just in the past week or two have warned of a revival of death squad tactics, and I think, to reinforce what Steve said, I think we ought to realize that the Guatemalan Accord arranged by President Arias of Costa Rica is somewhat popular in the region because it's really an incumbents protective agreement. It really was signed by 5 sitting presidents because they saw in it elements that could maintain their hold on office, and I think Duarte is counting on that accord to do that. I've been asked by the television people if you would ask all your questions at the 2 microphones in the aisles. Yes.
Very hard to do.
Mr. Codry, the question deals with SDI, a 2-part question. Number 1, do you believe that the United States, regardless of who is elected president, will continue with an SDI program? And number 2, do we have any evidence as to what degree the Soviet Union is equal or surpass or under our program, SDI?
I guess everyone heard those questions. Are we all right on that? My judgment in answer to the first question is yes, the United States will continue SDI no matter who the president is, and although they may invent some new name for it. It has a large constituency, and the argument about the Strategic Defense Initiative today is really in what way to continue it as research, or to go into testing, or to break out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty and deploy it, which is we're by no means ready to do, nor will we be much before the end of the century. So I think research at a minimum will continue. I think SDI will go along for $2 or $3 billion a year at least. The other question was, if I understand, to estimate the capabilities of the Soviet Union in this regard. The Central Intelligence Agency says that the Soviets soon, if not now, could interfere with American satellites with ground-based lasers, and later than soon, whenever that might be, let's say after the turn of the century, they would be in position to use their lasers against our missiles. I have worked a lot on SDI. I don't claim to know nearly as much as some of its critics claim to know. But what I think is that the Soviets have been working on it a lot longer than we have, and that they're absolutely petrified at the thought of what we could do if we decide to do it.
May I have a short follow-up? Short follow-up is simply this. Could you explain to us the difference, if there is one, between testing and deployment? I'm referring practically now to a ground-based laser.
Well, I see what you're getting at, but if you have one ground-based laser you might be able to make a nuisance of yourself, but you're certainly not going to be able to shoot down 1,000 incoming warheads or 3,000. You'd have to deploy a very considerable array of defensive weapons to have any hope of doing that.
Thank you for the privilege of asking a question. Gentlemen, what is your view of the possibility of linking human rights with arms reduction, especially vis-a-vis the letting our people go from the Soviet Union, letting the Jews who wish to exit from the Soviet Union, leaving Russia? And in that connection, what do you think the impact of the 200,000 who stood in Washington to ask for their freedom would have on human rights and on their leaving the Soviet Union?
Want me to try it? My first cut at it is that an arms control agreement is signed by the two countries, or by any countries that sign one, but you have in mind ours and the Soviets, because it is in the security interest of the countries that have negotiated and signed the agreement, and that as far as human rights are concerned, that as important as they are, and as much in violation of international charters as the Soviets are, probably the two will not be linked. But I'd like to hear what Steve would have to say about that too, because he was in on a lot of that summit stuff where Gorbachev showed his spleen whenever the subject came up.
I think in an ideal world, one needn't have to worry about such things as the possibility of exercising what we consider an inalienable right to live where one wants. But this is not an ideal world. And immigration of Soviet Jews has really nothing to do with arms control, nor does human rights. It may have something to do with long-term stability in the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, but it has nothing to do with arms control. And if we're talking about human rights in the Soviet Union, why should we stop with just the Jewish population of the Soviet Union? Why should we be concerned only with them? Why not with the Crimean Tatars? Why not with the Volga Germans? Why not with the whole population which is subjected to a rule which we do not consider legitimate? Why stop with the Soviet Jews? If you do this, then you link everything and you make nothing possible. The perfect, in this case, is the enemy of the good.
I have a question for Mr. Cordry. If my memory serves me correctly, I think within the last year, possibly a little longer than that, both the Congressional Budget Office and the General Accounting Office came out with reports on the Defense Department, highly critical of our defense posture, our readiness for defense. Would you care to comment on those reports? I'm sure you know all about them. And give us your assessment of the readiness of our Defense Department to defend the country in view of the millions of dollars that have been spent.
Well, I'm not familiar with specific reports that you must have in mind. The Congressional Budget Office has not come out with reports critical of the Defense Department because it's nonpartisan. The General Accounting Office comes out with reports that are critical of the Defense Department at the rate of about a dozen a day because it's responsive to members of Congress who want to be critical of the Defense Department. I'm being a little sarcastic, and I ask you to forgive me for that. I can't tell you, except in gross terms, how well defended we are, but beyond peradventure of a doubt, we are greatly better off today than we were in 1979 when this defense buildup started as a result of actions in the U.S. Senate, and then in '81 when Reagan multiplied it. There's no question whatsoever that we are much better off than we were then. The real issue is whether we've got our money's worth. And the answer to that is that, as usual, we have not got our money's worth. You will never get your money's worth in defense if you base it on what is an economic unit of production and so on. You will always have service rivalries which bring you certain things you don't need. You will always have congressional pressures which cause you to buy things you don't want. And I think that one of the most revealing, it may be a little off the subject of your question, but I think one of the most revealing things that happened in the last week that the Congress was in town was this. Not all money appropriated for things that take a long time to produce is spent in the year in which it's appropriated. The Congress levied a ceiling on appropriations and a different ceiling and a somewhat lower one on expenditures for fiscal 1988. It just happened that if you weren't careful, you would appropriate money that would force up the spending ceiling. I don't want to get too complicated about this. You'll see my point when I get it. What the Congress did was to shove 2 aircraft carriers into the congressional resolution, the continuing resolution, at $6 billion, because that money would not be spent in fiscal 1988. They could go up to the appropriation ceiling, but they wouldn't have to worry about exceeding expenditure ceilings and hurting the deficit in fiscal 1988. About $300 million or something of the sort would be spent out of the $6 billion. Now, we may need aircraft carriers. For all I know, we need them urgently because of the things that are going on in the world. But I suggest to you that that is not the acme of military analysis that brought them into this budget. You want to follow up because maybe you've got something in mind I didn't touch on.
Not really. I don't think I would get the answer anyway.
Well, what do you want me to say? We're not defended?
No, I don't want you to say that. I want you to say what you think.
Well, I said what I think. I said
Okay.
that I think we have got infinitely better, infinitely is a very strong adverb. We got much better forces, and we should have. We have got the best educated and the best trained military men that we've had in the non-war time. We have certainly got the best equipment we've had. And when you read that we build weapons that don't work, think very hard about whether you want to believe that or not. We build some weapons that don't work. We build some other things that don't work in this country. But by and large, we've got the best ships and we got the best airplanes and the best tanks and the best people that any country has.
Well, my reason for asking this question really was that both of these reports to which I referred came to the general conclusion that after billions of dollars of expenditures, we were not appreciably any better in defense than we were when the Reagan administration started.
The Congressional Budget Office has not come to any such conclusion. I don't know of GAO reports. The CBO has not come to any such conclusion. I have read all their reports.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Brony, do you believe that our State Department will allow the military, especially Navy commanders, to shoot before they check with them about shooting? That's about to start. Those guns were locked, and they could not shoot them until they got permission from the State Department.
I'm sorry, what's the context? I don't understand what you
Do
mean.
you think that a military, I would have rejected the orders if I would have been the commander.
When, where?
And the start in the Mediterranean that lost 37 sailors.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said
You didn't
start.
say that.
It's the State Department that ties the hands of a commander.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that that's the case. Charlie knows much more about this than I do. I believe these commanders, such as the commander of the Stark, operate under something called the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement are sorted out, I think, between agencies, probably at the highest level, but between the State Department, the Defense Department, depending on what our political and military objectives are in the region. I think Charlie ought to be able to answer that with much more precision than I can.
No, the sad story of why the Stark didn't shoot is not related to anything that happened at Foggy Bottom.
Thank you for giving it its right name.
The fact is that the skipper of the ship was allowed to leave the Navy. The fact is that any American warship is authorized to defend itself anywhere on Earth at any time that anybody attempts to attack it. And there's no State Department rule that says it can't. There's a sufficiently messed up chain of command that extends back to the Pentagon without taking out anything on the State Department.
Mr. Stern, I'd like to, you brought up the subject of AIDS last year. There is 60,000 AIDS carriers in San Fran, with AIDS, not the virus, with AIDS, in San Francisco alone. What do you think the next administration is going to do about that hot baby?
The question has to do with AIDS. I'll try to deal with it in a foreign policy context.
Well, the reason...
It is a very serious foreign policy question because I think as the AIDS epidemic grows, you're probably going to see concerted world efforts to deal with this plague. There's going to have to be cooperation among nations in dealing with it, and I also think in a political sense there are people who think that this issue will raise deeper constitutional questions, questions about individual rights, about individual privacy, about balancing the public good with the rights of the individual that probably are almost unparalleled in the history of our country. But I must say that that's more a domestic than a foreign policy question.
The reason I put that under foreign policy, I understand there is 4 countries that are going to put restrictions on Americans going to their country. They're going to have to be tested for AIDS, and that's why I put it under foreign policy, sir.
Yeah, and I think that you're also finding similar issues about, and it'll be coming up about how the United States will deal with testing of visitors, of tourists, and of would-be immigrants to this country. As I said, this has the potential of being the most pervasive political issue of the next 2 decades. And it's going to raise questions, particularly on domestic policy, that might try our soul pretty deeply. Yes, sir.
I'm going to change focus slightly from AIDS to aid to Pakistan.
Yes.
My question is to any of the 3 distinguished panel members here. What are your opinions about the Reagan administration's policy of see no evil or hear no evil regarding its very staunch support of the dictatorial regime of General Zia in Pakistan, even though, number one, there was evidence a long time ago that the Pakistani regime was developing a nuclear bomb, number one, and number two, even though their policy to Pakistan would risk antagonizing India, which is much larger and I think more important to the stability of the region, and also India is one of the few democratic countries among the third world nations. So I was just interested in your opinions from both from a diplomatic as well as from a defense standpoint.
I guess that's yours.
I'm reminded of Browning's first law of diplomacy, and that is that politicians believe in solutions and diplomats believe in mitigation. That the outcome of all these things, I was thinking about this problem today, as a matter of fact, the Pakistani business, and the question of the research into a possible atomic bomb, and balancing this against the administration's interest and in applying the Reagan Doctrine to Afghanistan, for which Pakistani cooperation is essential. So you've got this tug in American foreign policy. You've got this tension of does the administration, or how vigorously does the administration prosecute its belief in backing the non-proliferation treaty and stopping the proliferation of nuclear weapons? To what extent will it impose the sanctions written into American law that American aid to Pakistan cannot be forthcoming unless the President of the United States finds, I believe, that there is no threat that the Pakistanis are developing a bomb. This against the fact that, as I said before, that without Pakistan's cooperation, the application of the Reagan Doctrine to Afghanistan, which is apparently working with some success, would not be feasible. So it's an imperfect world again. Now, I'm not president, thank goodness. I don't have to weigh the risks between Pakistan coming up with a bomb, which I think would cause such destabilization in the subcontinent that it would make the Afghanistan problem look like a picnic. Because I'm not an expert on the region, but history would suggest that if the Indians believe this to be the case, that there would probably be some sort of preemptive strike against the facility, probably with Soviet backing. I don't know, but one can see the whole house of cards tumbling on this. That's my opinion, which probably doesn't clarify things very much.
I think my concern was not just so much from the Indian standpoint, but I think for all of us here in this room, we should be concerned because Pakistan is pretty close to Libya. And rumor has it that Libya has financed a great portion of the program. So
the Islamic bomb.
From that standpoint, I think all of us should be concerned, and not just the Indians only. So my question was, I guess I didn't enunciate it as such, but I think in retrospect, our concern should be twofold, both from an Indian perspective as well as from the perspective of us Americans sitting in this room and in this country. That we all know, history speaks for itself about Libya's policies or antics, whatever terminology you want to use.
Yes.
Mr. Stern, I'd like to make two observations with you. Last year when you addressed this, you hit the president over the head on his popularity drop. Best I know, and I stood up then and told you it would recover, I think you recall, and last I saw him at the Gorbachev deal was about 83%, quite a recovery. I'm wondering if the Sun papers somehow or other could contrive to put one panelist on the panel that would be on the conservative viewpoint. If you don't have
conservative?
Are you a conservative? Okay. The label reads, okay, we'll buy that.
I just asked how conservative. I didn't say I was.
I thank you for the compliment. Usually, don't get them.
The second observation is this year you come forthrightly and start hammering our president on the head on the budget, failing to even mention, not even suggest, that the prior administrations had sadly neglected the military and many other expenses that were not directly attributable to the president. But we'll pass on to the next observation. One, let's take a real look at what this president has done. He came into office with a agenda. He knew where he wanted to go, and he got it in. And unfortunately, it didn't get enacted into law in regards to our help in our own personal reductions in income taxes for about a year and a half, as I recall, due to the Speaker of the House.
What's your question, sir?
My question is, as an observation, that we go ahead and look at what he did. He knew he had to build the armaments, the military, because it's the only thing that you're really going to get any place with the Russians. He accomplished that. Now he's done, and you didn't mention it, the first time in the history of mankind, small as it is, he's pulled out, well, it's not quite signed yet, but I think it will be, and then they're going to go after the IBMs. And so I hope possibly that some consideration could be given on a better balance when we start hitting our president. Thank you.
The three well-known liberals on the panel take note of your comments. Yes, please.
No, I'm sorry. I want to say something here. I mean, I think, maybe, possibly you're doing something right when you respond that the defense buildup has made us much more ready, and the follow-up question is, are you telling us the truth? And then you're told you haven't mentioned the defense buildup, which is very important. Now, it seems to me maybe we've got something right down the middle here. I don't know.
Yes.
All right, this is to Mr. Bruning and/or Mr. Cordray. Do you foresee, looking to the future, a continuing U.S. foreign policy of intervention at every possible communist threat, real or imagined, throughout the world? In other words, to what extent are we going to continue to sort of try to police the world?
Well, when one takes the stipulations in your question, the answer is easy. It's no. But I don't really think that that's the answer that you're groping for. You know, we haven't done exactly what you've hinted in your question. There are lots of communist places that the United States hasn't intervened. Soviet Union is one.
Well,
I'll leave it to Steve to pick it up because he covers diplomacy and speaks tactfully.
I understand. I think I understand what you mean. First of all, I think it might be useful to distinguish these interventions by area. And I think there's one common thread to all of them. If we take, say, Angola, Afghanistan, and Nicaragua, and maybe you had more in mind. I don't know. These are.
well, some in Africa. Yeah.
Well, I'm hard pressed to think of a communist regime in Africa that we're trying.
Well, I mean, a potential.
We've supported Mozambique.
Exactly. We're supporting the Mozambican government.
Mm-hmm.
But in any case, these three countries are distinguished because they lie outside the center of, I'm going to qualify this, outside the center of interests that both of us, the Soviet Union and the United States, consider to be vital.
Right.
There's not this kind of intervention in Poland. There's not any fooling around in Hungary, East Germany, things like this. But these, they also have the characteristic that the administration, through the Reagan doctrine, is trying to restore the status quo. Because in each of these cases, these are, if you call them gains or losses, if it's a zero-sum kind of a situation, if these countries now are to be considered Soviet assets or allies or clients, they were not before. These are changes that were made within the last decade. The Reagan administration, as I think I said earlier, through the Reagan doctrine, is trying to demonstrate that these kinds of gains are, in fact, reversible. So it's not intervention willy-nilly all around the world. It's intervention according to a certain scheme. And do I think it will continue along this formula? It would depend very much on who's elected president. If there's a liberal Democrat, I would guess not. If there's a more conservative Republican, I would guess the possibility is greater.
Okay, thank you.
Notably absent from your comments tonight has been any discussion of the Middle East. Would any of the panel or all of the panel care to comment on what they see for 1988 with the two separate but linked problems of the Iran-Iraq war and the Palestinian-Israeli situation?
Well, on the political side of that, and then I'll turn this over to my colleagues, among the Democrats, Senator Gore has supported what the administration is doing so far as the reflagging of the Kuwaiti ships and U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf. Most of the other Democratic candidates have been critical about it, but have been very hazy as to what particular policies they would follow so far as safeguarding freedom of navigation and a flow of oil. So far as the politics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I haven't seen any of the candidates take on this issue frontally in any way. It's almost a non-issue in terms of going after votes in the primaries.
You know, what I'm going to say sounds like a cliche. I mean, but I'm very serious about it. I think in 1988 and all these regional wars, they're either going to be a Herculean effort to bring them to a halt, or things are going to become very, very fierce. And as I say, it may sound like a cliche because it's either going to stop or it isn't, but in the Iran-Iraq war, even the Soviets are getting a little annoyed with the Iranians and may even make good on their promise to us to participate in sanctions. They may be willing to join in a UN force that they don't dominate. I'm talking about things way down the road. But this war is in its eighth, ninth year. I've lost track of it. It's gone on too long now. And now I think the same thing is to be said about the war in Afghanistan. That one is entering its ninth year. And I think that you're going to see efforts made in Central America. And if they fail, it looks to me as if we've got a worse situation than we have going into the year. Israel strikes me as being a powder keg that's ready to blow. I must confess I haven't done deep work on this subject, but for many long years, Israel's problems have been at its borders with the occasional terrorist. Now, how incendiary this situation may become, it seems to me, is one of the most pressing questions before us. And I certainly don't have any answer.
If I could just make one I hope, brief comment on this, and I'm glad you brought this up. I think what recent events, what present current events are showing is that, to no one's surprise, is that the region is one of great instability. It's one of potentially catastrophic instability. It also shows, I believe, when you discuss the current Israeli problems in Israel, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Iran-Iraq war, it shows that you can have a war in the Middle East that is not centered or focused on the Arab-Israeli problem. They have not yet melded. I don't think that they will meld, and I don't think you're suggesting that. I'd just like to make one last observation, and that has to do with sort of unintended consequences. This may be a little slightly longer answer than you may want. But one of the results of the Iran-Contra business, the fact that the United States, behind the backs of its moderate Arab friends, the oil producers in the Gulf, was selling arms to the Iranians against all promises, and therefore aggravating Arab fears of instability of their regimes and Iranian expansionism. When this became revealed, there was a great crisis of confidence among these moderate Arabs. So in sort of overreaction